Hello and welcome to our Managing Performance lecture. First of all, I'm very sorry that I had to cancel our session yesterday at such a late notice. I actually had some urgent medical condition and had to go to hospital. But everything is fine now, so let's continue with this. It is, of course, the reduced session of what we would usually have. Right, so last week we did our learning and development presentations, and I know we still have one group left, so that's moved to next week, so you can't escape. The last group is presenting next week, and then everybody will receive their feedback. In today's session, or in yesterday's session, we were going to talk about the term performance management and individual objectives, and then also what a manager was to do in an appraisal. And then I want to talk a little bit about what we are going to do next week and then after the spring break. Now, you are meant to do a little exercise at this stage of the lecture. So I'm going to ask you to pause the video and open exercise 1 on Blackboard. Now, don't cheat. I know if you haven't paused the video. No, I'm only joking. But it does help if you do the exercise because you'll understand the lecture a little bit more. Okay, have you all done the exercise? Then here it's time for a little bit of a joke. Haha. Okay, UHR and managing performance. So effective management is the key to getting the best from your team and ultimately meeting business objectives. Both effective and ineffective performance should be managed to ensure desired results are achieved. We talked last week a little bit about this when we were talking about learning and development, and we talked about the different needs of why somebody needs training. So we had a discussion about people that might need training because they are not performing up to the standard that we are expecting them to. When we say both effective and ineffective performance should be managed, what we mean to say there is that if we have people performing well, so people are achieving their objectives and doing their job well, then we should recognize that. We should recognize that either in the form of a salary increasement, a bonus, additional training or benefits, or just an encouragement with a pat on the shoulder. If we've got ineffective performance, then we should definitely manage that because in the end it will result in a negative bottom line for our business. We talked 30 years ago about managing, whilst now a lot of times in business we're talking about managing performance. What we see is in the world, of course, is that we've gone more global. We've got now we've got larger businesses than 30 years ago where we had fewer businesses. And before it used to be a culture of 9 to 5 working. We had slower communication and we didn't really have good IT. If any of you were working, maybe you're a little bit too young for that. But if you were working in the 80s, we had massive computers. And we didn't have things like the internet, etc. until maybe the early 2000s. So we had to do everything with faxes and memos. And it definitely wasn't possible to communicate on an international level the way we do now. So at that time, we had less cost saving. There were less options for how we worked. If people wanted to work from home, that was simply not possible. And we couldn't measure exactly the contribution of the people. Now when we talk about managing performance, of course, we've got larger businesses. A lot of our companies have gone national and international. We have a 24/7 culture, and we've got very rapid and developing IT. So we also need to measure how we're actually performing on the job during those 24/7 hours. So when we talk about profits, and especially in the service industry, it's about people as well. So we're not just hiring a pair of hands. We're not just saying we need somebody to just distribute things. We are more hiring minds, and this is when graduates come in. We want to make sure that the people have good behavior, good attitudes towards work, and that they're motivated and that they're able to perform and have a valued contribution. We've also, of course, got more people owning our companies. We've got more stakeholders involved. We touched a little bit on that last week as well. So we're talking about people that are not just family-owned businesses, but stakeholders, if you look at the case study of Heat. And these people want to see financial reports. They want to see them maybe at 6 months or maybe at 12 months. And therefore we must report performance. And we can't just report performance in financial figures, we have to justify those financial figures. And that comes down to measuring the performance per individual. At all times we must ensure that we save cost and improve our efficiencies. So we need to make sure that we're not spending money regardless, and that we have the fastest processes of doing things. We need to achieve more with less. When you read theory on managing performance or performance management, there are two different things. Managing performance is making sure that your team are able to deliver performance targets. So this is when you set your staff performance targets, you set them objectives, and you make sure that they've got the resources or the training to deliver those performance targets. This is you as a manager managing performance. When we talk about performance management, it's often when employees are not performing. So often we have this process, which we will discuss in our next session, not lecture 10, but lecture 8. And we are actually having a process of managing, of performance management. So where we have steps where employees are not actually doing what they need to do, resulting in a disciplinary process and eventually termination of their contract. Managing performance is a term used to describe the systems and processes used to get the best from people at work and drive profitability up through the targeted effort people make. It's getting the best from people and making sure that they are doing what the company needs in the right way at the right time. There's a lot of research that actually shows that managing performance works and making sure that our employees have these resources and training to achieve the targeted effort. Persil talks about having targeted recruitment, making sure we've got the right fit, job security, more career opportunities, etc., etc. Now, last week we talked a little bit about individual objectives when we talked about learning and development. So here we see on this slide a little bit of a brain map that I did quite a few years ago for a company when I was brainstorming about our HR department. And I was thinking at first, what we see in the left corner is what are we trying to achieve, so as a business. So that means setting objectives in line with business and department strategy. So we talked a little bit about that last week, where I gave the example of when you want to upsell in a company. You've got Carluccio's who needed to sell a lot of bottles of wine, and we talked about how a manager can actually then give training to their employees and give them targets to sell this wine. Now the next step is thinking about how are we doing. So this is through ongoing feedback. So just like with the students, we need to give continuously feedback on how they're doing through one-to-one feedback, so one-on-one, manager on employee. This can be during a shift, it can be after a shift, it can be formal, informal, in any way. And doing a mid-year review, so every 6 months having an informal appraisal that's not necessarily recorded, but thinking about how the employee is doing, if they're able to achieve their targets. And then once a year have an annual appraisal, so formally record how the employee is doing and perhaps seeing if they need any help. So then the next step, of course, is how am I going to manage? So we need to make sure that we are meeting the learning needs and that we are development planning. And then from there we can move on to professional development plan for the employee, where they are actually then able to move up to new objectives. What we see here is a very simplified performance cycle, and you do see many versions of this in many textbooks, but the performance cycle basically starts with setting objectives, which we've discussed, and then we have to monitor performance, so we actually make a record of how the people are performing. We appraise their performance, and then we set new objectives. If you look at the big circle here, it says performance of individuals and companies. And this is what we talked about last week as well. So a company needs to make profit, and therefore they set themselves targets. These targets are filtered down to departments. So for example, a department could be a property of the Hilton, and the general manager gets objectives there to increase profit or maybe to cut cost. The general manager will go down to the food and beverage manager with a target and say to the food and beverage manager, we need to save costs in our breakfast service. So we need to make sure that our breakfast service, we're going to reduce the cost even though we're going to produce the exact same amount of breakfast covers. Now the food and beverage manager then needs to talk to their manager on duty doing breakfast and set specific standards, for example looking at staffing costs, or maybe looking at the amount of resources we use as in cutlery and breakfast equipment, etc. And they need to make sure where they can actually save more money, and these become objectives then. And if the breakfast manager is able to do this, then of course the food and beverage manager is able to achieve targets for the food and beverage department and in turn the general manager. But if they're not, then in return the general manager is not meeting targets for the hotel and the company is not meeting targets for themselves. So why are objectives important? The first stage in performance management cycle is setting out what is expected of people through objective setting, and we can do this through job description, project charters and development plans. So when you're an employee, where do your objectives come from? Well, first of all from above, as just explained in the general manager's example and also in the Carlucci's example from last week. We've got strategies from above, so these objectives are filtered down. Also from the job, so depending on which job you're actually doing within your organization, you will have certain objectives coming that are job related. And then from the person, because we're trying to keep all of our employees motivated at all times, and every employee has different development needs or different development wants, we have objectives in there that are completely allocated just for that one person. Now this diagram then is not something you will find in the textbook because it's my model, but it's basically filtering down exactly what I've just said in your example about the general manager and also Carluccio's. So we've got a global goal for a company, which is filtered down to a regional goal, and then we've got a country or branch or property goal, which is filtered down to a team or department, and then down to an individual objective. And an individual or an employee, somebody like a waiter or a receptionist or a tour operator, that needs to achieve or excel on these individual objectives, which will result in the team or department achieving these objectives, which will result in the country, branch or property achieving those objectives, which will result in the region and then of course the global company achieving results. Now, some other reasons why objectives are important is because first of all they encourage people to fulfill their potential. They give a clear picture of what each person is expected to achieve. It's very nice to be in a job knowing exactly what you need to do. If you don't know what you need to do, then you don't know if you're doing well or if you're not doing well. So having a clear picture helps you and keeps you motivated. It gives an opportunity to reward performance. Because we've got objectives, we can measure them And therefore we can say if people are actually achieving or maybe exceeding the objectives, and we can give them suitable rewards. It helps build team spirit, because as a team you always want to achieve those objectives together. And we can also, of course, use them to define our training and development needs. If people are not achieving objectives, then we know that we need to provide training. It can help individuals focusing on achieving results. So this then again is probably related to rewarding performance, or if people have a promotion in mind, they know how to get there. It gives them a clear picture of what's expected to achieve. And of course, as a company, we can have a process for managing the good, standard and the poor performers. When we set objectives, we need to make sure these are SMART. SMART stands for specific, measurable, achievable, realistic and timed. And that means that when we set objectives, they need to be first of all specific. So they need to not be too broad. So you can say, for example, I want you to answer every telephone call within 3 rings, instead of saying I want you to answer every telephone call. Okay, so it's very specific. Measurable, in there you've got the 3 rings, so we can measure it. Achievable is very important, because if people don't think it's achievable, if 3 rings is just impossible because they're too busy, then we need to either change the objectives or provide resources for it as well. Realistic then, of course, this is also depending on what the employee thinks and the training and development they've had. And then there needs some timing in there so that we can measure it. So on the right hand side we see here a few examples. The first one is, I am going to get my assignment done. Now, we might think this is a good objective, but in reality, if we look at it, what it says is that you're going to do your assignment at some stage. Maybe you're thinking to do your assignment by next year. So we don't really know when are you going to do it. Therefore, we can't measure it, and therefore we can't see if it's achievable and realistic. If we look at the second example, I'm going to lose 5 kilos by February 14th by going to the gym twice a week and cutting out all booze. Now this is of course very specific. It's got exact measurements and time frames in there. It's measurable because we can say by February 14th we want to lose 5 kilos, and also we're looking at going to the gym twice a week. It's possibly achievable if somebody is drinking quite regular. That's a lot of calories, and if they're going to the gym twice a week from now on and they haven't done before, then 5 kilos is probably feasible from whichever time frame this objective was set. And therefore it becomes realistic, and of course it's timed. So that's setting objective. Now we've also got monitoring performance. We can monitor performance in different ways, and the one I've put here is through the performance dashboard. The performance dashboard, or the balanced scorecard, was developed by Kaplan and Norton in 1996, and at the moment we've got more than 50% of organizations using it. And these include the NHS, PricewaterhouseCoopers, Selfridges nationwide, but also Tesco and many other hospitality organizations. Basically what it is, it's a system, it's a software where every department enters the information and it builds up to form a company picture of how we are performing. Here's an example of the balanced scorecard in Tesco. So this is kind of a diagram that would come out from the software, and it's a very simple tool for managers then to look and see how we're actually doing as a company, how we are likely to achieve our objectives by the end of the year, and we can do a midterm review either for financial reports or to ensure that we've got the right resources and training and development in place for our employees to achieve those objectives. A balanced scorecard we can translate into reports, and therefore it helps answer key business critical questions. From the financial aspect, we can tell our shareholders what we're doing and how we're looking. Our systems, we can think about our systems, our processes, our IT, what are we good at, what are we not so good at. With people, we can see how do we continue to improve and create value, how do we keep our employees motivated, how can they achieve their objectives, do they have the right training and resources. And another important perspective is actually getting the customer point of view. So how do customers see us? So maybe we are doing well with the first 3 bullets, but the balance scorecard will also tell us the viewpoint of customers. An underlying use of balance scorecards as well is when you have a large HR department, which international companies have. We can use the balance scorecard to calculate the cost of the workforce, the contract types, etc. We can have systems for managing the workforce, so we can have the right skill mix, making people multitasking as well, multi-skilled. We can get training and development both on and outside of the job, and we can see how we are seen as an employer from a value perspective. Now, the next step in the performance management cycle is appraising the performance, and most companies have a set system in place for this. It's only the very small companies often that don't have an appraisal system in place of some kind. The performance appraisal is the process by which an employee's contribution to the organization during a specified period of time is reviewed and assessed. So what we're saying here is that an employee is trying to achieve these objectives, and they're contributing to the organization, and we're talking about a specified period of time, so either 6 or 12 months often, or in probation sometimes it's 3 months, and we're reviewing it as a manager and with the employee, and then we're assessing it. Okay, so we're giving it a rating. More and more companies are using a grading performance, and I will touch up on that in a second. And what we're saying is that employees are expected to meet the expectation in order to receive a standard company salary increase based on inflation. So many companies are saying, okay, if an employee actually meets their objectives, which is basically doing their job, then they will get the standard salary increase, and most companies base that on inflation of the market. But if employees are exceeding expectations, so they're going above meeting their objectives, they're achieving more than objectives, then we can give them a bonus, or we can give them a promotion or development. And when employees are not meeting expectations, then we need to manage the situation. So this then is an example of a grading system and individual scoring. So what we see is out of 5, we've got number 3, meeting expectations. So a business would want most of their employees to meet expectations and meeting objectives. If most of the employees are meeting objectives, that means that the company is able to meet objectives. Now, in every department, you're going to have outstanding employees that are either exceeding number 4 or have outstanding contributions. And those are the people that are able to do just a bit more, maybe because of their experience, maybe because they're putting in more hours, or maybe because they're just more capable. And these people are what we call our talented workforce, and we need to manage them. We need to reward them in some way. And then in each department, we'll have people who are not meeting all of our objectives, and some people who are just failing. And we need to, again, deal with that as well. We need to make sure that we take action so that they either are able to achieve objectives in the next term, or that we maybe cut our losses and start procedures for maybe terminating their employment. Overall, the department needs to make sure that they are meeting objectives or meeting expectations as a department, or exceeding it. Now, for an appraisal process, most companies use a self-appraisal to start with. At the beginning of this session, I asked you to do activity 1. Still not sure how many of you actually did it watching this video, but a self-appraisal often helps employees really appraising their own performance, so being honest about how they've been performing over that period of time. Now, if you mark your own assignment before you hand it in, so if you draft mark your assignment, then often that's fairly accurate of the kind of grade you are going to get if you're honest there. Then the next thing is a review meeting where the employee and the manager discuss the self-appraisal. So the employee has done the self-appraisal and the manager will discuss how much that is in line with what the manager actually believes the performance has been. And again, if it's a fair and honest self-appraisal, and often these are very similar to what the manager would have said. And then there is a final meeting where the manager, after considering all the appraisals of the department and after considering the overall performance of the department, the manager will inform the employee of the grade they have achieved and therefore what reward or development they will get from that. And this is then a diagram exactly of the appraisal process. So the preparation is where a manager would get input from colleagues of the employee. They might not ask them direct, but they might have something on record. Input from customers, which includes customer complaints and customer recommendation. Input from other leaders, so other managers or team leaders that are have an opinion of this person, and then the self-evaluation. So the self-appraisal of the employee. And that's the preparation from the manager. They then have the review meeting where the manager and employee discuss, and then is the evaluation stage where the manager evaluates all the performance of their department and maybe also of other departments with other managers and decide on the final grade of their employees. And then there's the feedback meeting. Now, what happens when performance is poor? When performance is poor, we need to make sure that we have given feedback at the right time. So, for example, if you tell an employee after 6 months that the way they actually explain the menu to a customer is incorrect, then you've not given feedback at the right time. The way to do is to observe the employee during restaurant service, watch them explaining the menu to the customer. If they don't do it right the first time, then maybe watch them again, and then either after the shift or before the next shift, give them feedback about what you've observed and do a little bit of a role play session with them on how to present the menu correctly, and then observe them again. That's the way you give feedback, through informal one-to-ones and maybe an informal mid-year review. We need to make sure that we are being objective about what is required in the job. So sometimes we need to make sure that we are objective and that we're not subjective to the person. So we're making sure that we are fair and honest towards the employee and not biased. We need to be accurate and specific with feedback, so there's no point of talking around it, so that we need to make sure that the employee actually understands what we mean by the feedback. We need to focus on the behavior, not the person. So if a person is not behaving correctly, then we can't say that that's down to the person. It might mean that it just needs a little bit of more training or understanding. And lastly, we need to be consistent. We need to make sure that even if we've got friends in the department, we manage all of our employees the same. So these are just a few basic rules. On top of these rules, then, there is official policies on managing performance, so legislation, law, and we will be discussing that next week. Now, when we reward performance, if performance is good, then we need to think about that we've either got individuals that are exceeding or achieving targets, or departments. So maybe we have systems in place where we reward individuals, and maybe we have systems in place where we reward a complete department. Of course, in the service industry, we are relying a lot on teamwork. So often it's linked to the department for achieving objectives. And if somebody's really gone above and beyond, we give them a little bit of a reward as an individual. And that can be either money or benefits or free stays, etc. Some companies don't have any structure for rewards and salaries, and that makes it very difficult in financial reports to justify employee cost. Now, my final activity that I'm going to ask you to do, and this is homework for next week, is to actually look at the case study that I've attached, and that is the second assignment, and to read that carefully and start considering the questions, okay? And then what we'll try and do is discuss them next week in class. Now, as I said in the beginning of the session, we are going to change a little bit the remainder of the module compared to your module study guide. And what we're going to do, and this is really just to prepare all of you on time for your assignment, is next week we're going to do policies and procedures and the exit strategy all together. So next week you'll have your final session, your final theory, and then we will do the week after Easter. So you have all of Easter break, 2 weeks to get all on top of your assignments. We'll do scheduled 1-to-1 tutorials, and that schedule will be put on Blackboard, where you have 5 or 10 minutes to meet with myself and discuss your progression so far. Then in week 10 we'll do the practice presentations, and week 11 we can do 1-to-1 tutorials where you request to see me. Your submission is in week 12, and then in week 13 we're going to discuss your assignment 2, which is your placement assignment. Okay, now that's everything from me. Thank you very much for listening to me for over half an hour. Maybe not as entertaining or productive as a lecture, but still it's giving you a little bit of an overview of the slides. And I'll see you all next week.